Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, which is organized by the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center's Clinical Course Steering Committee. We're glad to present today virtual technologists in dementia practice and research, and we're joined by four tremendous speakers, which I'll introduce one by one as we go forward. I would ask you to mute your mics if you're not speaking. And also to add any questions you might have to the Q&A. We will let the first the four speakers present. They have 10 minutes each, and then we'll have ample time to get to your questions at the end as a panel. Also, if you wanted to watch this presentation again or share with others, it will be posted on the YouTube channel for NAC about a week later, and you will get an email letting you know so. All right, without further ado, let's start with Dustin Hammers, who's our first presenter. Dustin is an associate professor in neuropsychology at University of Utah. He is the clinical director of the neuropsychology services of the Division of Cognitive Neurology, and he is spending enormous time in training for other professionals and in clinical services and also research. He has recently published and presented on Teleneuropsychology in COVID times, and this is why he's here today. And the best kept secret is that he will be joining us at Indiana University in May. Welcome, Dustin.
Thank you very much. I am...
Oh, I gotta stop sharing.
I'm trying to switch over. There we go.
There you are.
Thank you very much, Liana. Really excited to chat with everyone today. Excited to hear the rest of the talks that are going on. A lot of good information today. And I'm going to be covering over the next 10 minutes the ethics and practice of teleneuropsychology, which admittedly I frequently give about a 90-minute talk on this. So it's going to be a very quick crash course. I'm happy to chat with anyone offline or answer any questions otherwise. I don't have any disclosures. And so when we're considering discussing ethics and teleneuropsychology or teleassessment in general, we need to really be thinking about what are the best, what services in the best interest of the examinee. Now we have many different things that may be going on at the time. We may have clinical needs or research needs, and there are additionally changes or modifications to an evaluation that we may be giving. So we need to really be thinking about, are we considering ethics related to responsible caring, or are we considering ethics related to the respect for dignity of peoples and persons? And regardless of the code that you're considering of ethics, the American Psychological Association, American Medical Association, the Canadian Psychological Association, these two codes in different names tend to be the core juxtaposition that you're trying to decide upon when conducting virtual assessments. We're wanting to make sure that we do no harm, yet at the same time provide services in a distributively just way. And so even during now with COVID, there are a variety of ethics codes and guidelines of best practices that we can use to make sure that we're following up on the best suggestions possible. I'm going to be speaking very briefly about the American Psychological Association's telepsychology guidelines. And there are 8 guidelines. I have a link in the resources at the end that you can consider. And I'm going to be talking about the standards of care, assessment components, and interjurisdictional practice, just very briefly. And the most important components here are that we have the same responsibilities as providers, as researchers, when we're doing virtual assessments as when we're doing in-person assessments. This makes sense, of course, and we need to really consider what benefits are there to the patient or participant for this versus the risks. Obviously, the pros are increased access to care, reduction of travel, but there are a number of issues related to information security or managing emergency situations, inability to control the environment, as well as potential threats to validity or boundaries that we really do need to consider. And again, this is much more information than to cover just over the next probably 8 minutes now. But when we're thinking about standards of care, we really need to think about 3 different components. That is the cognitive severity of the individual we're working with, the psychiatric or behavioral severity, as well as what therapeutic needs does the specific situation require. And so as far as cognitive severity, we know particularly, with the age groups we're working with in the NAC, individuals may have neurodegenerative conditions or being of certain ages that cognitive testing over the computer may be too challenging for them. And so that's really something that we need to consider. And then secondly, testing over this modified rapport scenario over the computer may result in the individual being too emotionally labile to be able to sit with kind of the admitted awkwardness of conducting something over Zoom. And additionally, if you are providing clinical services and providing feedbacks for individuals, use with emotionally challenging information, such as providing a feedback session with that someone has Alzheimer's disease. That is something that we really need to think about. Is video remote assessment the best modality for that? It may be a great starter, and ensuring that people have a safety net afterwards to talk with someone in person if necessary. And then other factors to consider could be connectivity. I don't want to jinx us, but with virtual appointments, it seems like what can go wrong with bandwidth usually does. Additionally, as far as language goes, we know that a patient with aphasia or a participant with severe hearing loss may have difficulty with cognitive assessment in general. So when you add in the added layer of having this done over the computer, this can make it much more difficult. And if we are considering the medical conditions of some patients or participants, virtual assessments may not be the best way to go. Someone who has epilepsy, for example, you need to really think about what the emergency management plan is for that patient. What happens if they have a seizure on the other end of the line and there's no one there for them to take them to the hospital? If this is a clinical appointment, are you as a provider responsible for their care in that situation? And so really for all of these factors, it's ideal to have the remote appointment not the first thing that you encounter with the individual, but instead meeting with them beforehand to discuss things. Additionally, specifically related to assessment, we need to ensure that the psychometric properties of the tests we're using are preserved and that the conditions that we are administering the measures are what the test manuals would like us to be doing. We know that there can be alterations with reliability and validity if we're using something created for in-person testing when that is applied to teletechnology. And then additionally, we know that there can be alterations from standardization. And so test manuals typically encourage people to provide assessments in a secure room, which is free from distractions from either family or support staff of some kind. And so we need to ensure that the environment that we're using is coincides with the environment that the materials were intended to be used so that we can have confidence in the results. And then additionally, in terms of validity, we need to be thinking about construct validity. Is the measure assessing what we intend for it to measure? Or when we're giving a memory test, is this actually tapping into someone's memory? Or are they getting some instructions from family member or altered instructions in such a fashion that this leads to, it may be a harder task for them, or it may be an easier task. That could influence things. Additionally, if we're not actually in the room with someone, are there sights or smells or sounds or temperature changes that could be going on in that room that we don't know about that could lead to distraction? And then lastly, as far as test security, we want to make sure we're discussing and considering that regardless of the modality that we're assessing someone, there are test security ethics and there are ethical components, and there are copyright laws that inform how we act. And just because we're using something over Zoom, for example, does not mean that we get to ignore some of the copyright laws and test security issues. And if we're in a clinical setting and we're trying to apply clinical norms, normative comparisons to interpret performance, the reality is there are no norms derived specifically for telehealth. But we need to be, we can use pre-existing norms as long as we're applying conservative interpretations and expanding the confidence intervals so that we're not overly attributing memory deficit if someone had difficulties with bandwidth or the computer screen glitched or something like that. And so lastly, I just want to mention it's important if we're providing clinical services to make sure that we have the proper licensure. In the United States, you need to have the same, you need to be licensed in the state of where the individual is sitting. Now, this may not directly apply as much to some research modalities, but in general, it's important as providers and researchers for us to know the relevant laws of where the individuals are sitting, which generates which jurisdiction is guiding those laws. And actually, I just want to point out if there's a discrepancy, if you're providing services, for me, if I'm providing services in Utah to an individual in Wyoming, for example, and there's a discrepancy between the Utah and the Wyoming law. The American Psychological Association suggests that we follow the laws where the patient is sitting. However, the Canadian Psychological Association actually indicates a different standard, and I like this better. It actually says if there's a discrepancy between the two jurisdictions, go with the one that has the higher standard. And that really speaks to the idea that we want to be putting our patients and our participants first in any of the activities we're doing. So thank you very much. Just a list of resources. And with that, I will share my slides or share my screen and we'll move on.
Thank you so much, Dustin. Let's move on and keep your questions for the end, please. Post them in the Q&A, please. The next speaker is Dr. Jane Martin. Can you please start sharing your screen, Dr. Martin? Dr. Martin is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York. She's the director of the Neuropsychological Center, as well as director of adult psychology training at the same institution. She's a senior neuropsychologist at Mount Sinai's Alzheimer's Disease Research Center too.
Here I am. Okay. Hi. So I'm talking about digital remote assessment, teaching interns how to, have to watch my time here, conduct telemedicine assessments. Hang on a minute. Okay, start. So COVID-19 called for a very rapid transition to two things: promoting remote clinical services and providing remote learning and training. Remote assessment, teleneuropsych, was around before, but typically video conferencing assessment was provided at the clinic where a patient came in and sat before a computer versus an in-home environment situation. Our group at Mount Sinai in New York, we rapidly responded to the pandemic and created a telehealth battery, deciding that a video conferencing platform was what we were going to go with and finding a HIPAA compliant platform. Let me just change page. Okay. So with regard to remote assessment, there's telephone and video conferencing to distinguish. So at our ADRC at Mount Sinai, New York, they have continued to conduct assessments, however, telephone only. And at our clinical neuropsych service, which is what I'm focusing on today, we are only doing video conferencing using a HIPAA compliant version of Zoom. Why is this not moving? Okay. To review, a classic clinical neuropsych evaluation involves an interview to gather background information, assess behavioral symptoms and functional decline, and assess and come up with an estimated premorbid ability. And then for the testing, we always start with a mini mental and then have tests that cover all of the domains of attention, memory, verbal fluency, language functioning, visual spatial ability, executive functioning, and a depression screen. So we quickly put together a teleneuropsych battery and of course realized the limitations at once. We were reduced to primarily being able to administer verbal measures. That's measures that could be administered verbally. The other thing that's very apparent is the limitation in assessing processing speed and motor functioning. So tests like scanning tasks and coding and traditional trail making A and B could not be performed. As time went on with the pandemic, we expanded our initial battery with the use of screen sharing of test materials when that became okay by publishers, so that we could use the screen and share images, stimuli like the Ray Osterreich complex figure, the Mini-Mental's pentagon, matrix reasoning from the waist, the Boston naming test, etc. We also expanded the battery to be able to do written materials, so they could copy a complex figure, draw a clock, draw the pentagons, etc. And what we've instructed our interns to do is the patient does this on the paper. They hold up the paper with the results to the camera so that the examiner can take a photo. They are then instructed to fold the paper in half and tear up the raw data. So our remote assessment consisted of the test that could be administered verbally. So we have a mini-mental. For memory, it's logical memory, the stories, a word list, either the HVLT, a 12-word list, or a CVLT, a 16-word, language, FAS, animal naming. I know you all know these tests. We switched to oral trails A and B. And from the waist, that's the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scales. For executive functioning, we use similarities, again, verbally administered. And for attention digit span, progressively longer strings of numbers, repeated forwards, backwards, and in sequence, a clock drawing test, and to assess mood, the GDS, the Geriatric Depression Scale. And with screen sharing, the tests that we could then include on the screen, mini-mental, the pentagons, the read and do aspect of close your eyes, memory, oops, oh my God, where am I? Sorry. The Rayo figure for language, Boston naming, and executive functioning, matrix reasoning, and even the Wisconsin card sort. So the mini-mental. We added a modified version, 27 out of 30 points. That's it, should be 27 instead of 30. So for orientation, the numbers 6 to 10, which relate to location, the answer should reflect the patient's current location or their home address. So they either provide their home address, but if a patient during the pandemic is staying quarantined at their son's house, for instance, they would have to give that address, which we verify. In terms of screen sharing, we did close your eyes and the pentagons, and the command task of take this paper in your right hand, fold it in half, put it on the floor, we chose to omit. Clock drawing test, which is a quick way to get a lot of information. Instructions, draw the face of a clock, place all the numbers in the correct position, draw the hands and set the time to 10 after 11. Again, the patient holds up the clock drawing on the paper to the camera. Examiner takes a photo. They're told to fold the paper in half and tear it up. So for memory, again, the verbal memory test, the stories and the word lists required no alteration. HVLT we went with initially because it was shorter. So in terms of brevity, we felt that was useful. As time went on, we will use a CVLT for a higher functioning patient or someone who we feel can withstand testing using this medium of, over a computer. And then for visual memory, we were able with screen sharing to include the Ray complex figure. So again, copy the figure, we take it away, then they draw it immediately. And then after a delay, they're instructed to hold it up. We photograph it, they fold it in half and they tear it up. So it was one thing to come up with a battery and figure out administration. Then we came up with standard operating procedures, which is really a two-step for us, SOPs. So first there was the pre-testing appointment that is conducted 1 to 2 days prior to testing. Firstly, it's to introduce the examiner to the patient and confirm the actual testing appointment. And primarily it's to confirm the feasibility of the technology. So one, accessibility. Obviously the patient has to have a computer or a tablet for this to happen. And then there's the capability aspect. Do they have the skill set necessary to use the computer, or do they have some tech assistance at home from their aide or their spouse or their son or daughter? Do they have a stable internet connection? And if they needed to download the platforms such as Zoom, we did that with them in this pre-testing appointment and had a practice session. We'd give it a shot. And then we briefly reviewed some of the parameters of the evaluation, like a quiet place without distractions, table and desk. So that's the pre-testing appointment. And then the day of, at the start of the testing session, our interns go through a very standardized checklist. So one is, are you seated at a table or a desk? Is this a private, quiet place without distractions? Cell phone has to be off. There cannot be any watch, clock, or materials nearby. No paper and pencil nearby until instructed. The computer or tablet needs to be fully charged. Is it plugged in? And no assistance from others on testing. And individuals who are present for the interview portion must be within view of the camera. We also assess, I'm sorry I didn't add it on the list, but to make sure of someone's vision and hearing ability. Can you hear me okay? Can you see me okay? So as training neuropsychologists, it's one thing to learn what the battery is, and it's one thing to learn how to administer tests. And typically, neuropsychologists are trained in how to establish rapport with the patient, how to set up that testing situation, which traditionally is in person. But there are clinical skills that are specific to remote assessment that we all had to discuss. Primarily, how to help the patient stay engaged and focused. And it is quite different than an in-person situation. One, we're two-dimensional here. We're flat, we're on a screen. There is a certain amount of fatigue in staring at a computer after a while. The most important thing that we have found with regard to keeping a patient engaged and focused has been maintaining good eye contact. So for instance, I instruct interns that they have materials to put their raw data on, their answer forms, their instructions, etc., not to have it at the side where they're talking to the patient like this and the patient sees the side of their face, or not to have it in their lap where they're down like this, but to have their materials in front of them, in front of the computer, or to the right or left of the computer, so they can be head on, to keep that patient engaged and to also be aware when the patient is wandering and losing attention. So we also need more verbal contact with the patient. We also, just to segue into tests, how are you doing? Gee, that was a tough one. Also to encourage breaks or stretching. How are you doing? Would you like to get up out of your chair? We can do a stretch right now. This all has helped keep the patients engaged and focused on the task, on the testing. The other aspect is to be aware of what I call maybe out of view. So something in their lap, if they're getting assistance. Very early on, late March last year, a patient's, oh my God, I'm almost out of time. A patient's wife walked by and said onion from a word list. So it's that kind of thing, to be aware that no one is around to give assistance. Paper and pencil isn't there to tempt them to write answers down. No smartphone, no watch. Let's see. So if I have a minute, I can, if I can still talk about the advantages. The main advantage to remote assessment is that patients continue to have access to healthcare. And I think this is here to stay, particularly with elderly populations, and we're providing a service in rural areas as well. They can be assessed from their home without the burden of travel. And we have confirmed the reliability of these measures. The disadvantage primarily is the technology issue. They've got to have the technology, be able to work it or get assistance. But the main thing is that we are able, both in person and remote, but we have learned that we can answer the referral question. We also add a disclaimer at the end, I think I've missed, saying that we conducted this over COVID. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. This was super informative and exceptional. Thank you. I'm sure there will be questions later. Next is Marty Sliwinski. Such a pleasure to have you here, Marty. Marty is a professor at in Pennsylvania State University, and he's the director of the Center for Healthy Aging there. And he has a UO2 grant focused on ambulatory methods for measuring cognitive change. And this is precisely what he's going to tell us about today. Welcome, Marty.
Thank you. So today, what I'd like to do is talk about how my colleagues and I have been using smartphones to assess and measure cognitive function in unsupervised settings. Oops. So this work is part of the Mobile Toolbox collaboration that I'll be talking about today. And this collaboration has the goal of building an open and extensible platform on Android and iOS for cognitive assessment that can be used to monitor change, and that's validated for self-administration by research participants, or hopefully by patients. Currently, we're still developing, still in the app development stage, but we're now beginning to transition to validation testing. And some of what I'll be describing, we've already done a fair amount of validity testing on some of the procedures. So our strategy is to do mobile cognitive testing in the context of ambulatory research methods. So these refer to things like ecological momentary assessment, or EMAs, or measurement bursts. And these types of ambulatory procedures or methods refers to procedures that permit measurement of behaviors, physiology, and psychological states in real time and in naturalistic settings. So to the extent we're not going to be doing this in a clinic or a lab, we're going to use methods that have been designed to assess these types of functions in natural settings. So what we do is we embed very brief cognitive tests into ecological momentary assessment, EMAs, using smartphones to do very frequent and brief administrations. And these can occur multiple times per day over the course of a couple days or even a couple weeks, depending on what the goal of the assessments are. These cognitive assessments are also made in conjunction with real-time self-reports of mood, psychological states, somatic states, and in the context of passive sensing to monitor behaviors and physiology that can help provide contextual information that's useful for interpreting cognitive performance. So let me show you a couple of the example mobile tests that we have developed and that we've been validating. We have about 7 or 8 different measures that are designed following a very specific design guidelines and principles, which I could talk about if people are interested. The first test I'd like to show you is the symbol match test of attention. These are screenshots from our mobile app. Participants or people working with the phones are asked to look at the symbol pair on the top and tap as quickly as they can the matching pair on the bottom. We get an accuracy measure as well as a throughput and speed measure. We also have the grid memory spatial working memory test that consists of 3 phases. In the first phase, 3 dots are presented at random locations on a 5x5 grid for a few seconds. Then as a distractor phase, they do a letter cancellation test, and this goes on for about 7 or 8 seconds. And then they're asked to tap the locations in an empty grid that represents where they had just seen the dots, and we get a measure of memory precision depending on how close their responses are to the originally presented locations. A third test is modeled very closely after PARA's visual short-term memory binding test, which has been shown to be very sensitive and specific to familial AD. In this task, participants see a few polygons for a few seconds during a study phase, and then immediately thereafter are probed with the same polygons, and they have to indicate whether or not they've changed colors or stayed the same colors. And in this example, the colors have been swapped, so they would respond different. These tests are designed to be administered very, very briefly, so each assessment takes about 45 seconds to do, with the idea that we're going to be doing more than one of them. And the exact time depends on how the investigator or the user configures the cognitive tests. So what I'd like to do is to demonstrate or provide some evidence of the feasibility of having older adults, including those with mild cognitive impairment, work with the smartphones and do these types of repeated testings. So in a community-based probability sample that's part of the Einstein aging study, a third of whom have been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, were asked to participate in a relatively intensive research design. This involved 6 assessments during the course of a day for about 2 weeks, 16 days. And they were prompted randomly at 4 times during the day to do these assessments. And then they were instructed also to remember to do them when they woke up in the morning and right before they went to bed. Despite the demanding protocol, adherence to this protocol was very high, with on average over 80% of the scheduled assessments being completed, although there was a slight difference in adherence between those with and without MCI, specifically for the types of assessments that people had to remember to do on their own. So we think that this difference in adherence is an incidental assessment of a prospective memory failure. Another demonstration of feasibility and acceptability on the part of patients comes from a study that Louisa Thompson is leading at Brown University called Digicog. This is more of a clinically oriented sample. 2/3 have undergone amyloid PET scanning, and the design that she's using is less intensive than the one I just described, where individuals are prompted 3 times throughout the day to do very, very brief assessments for a period of 8 days. And as you can see, the adherence and acceptability data are quite promising. Over half of these individuals had perfect adherence, completed all of the scheduled assessments, and the vast majority of individuals reported the app was very easy to use and would be willing to do this again on an annual basis as part of a regular screening for their PCP visits. So these 2 examples together illustrate that even though this sounds relatively demanding, and it is, with proper onboarding and training and the right design of an app, older adults will do this, are able to do it, and even if they have mild cognitive impairment. Now what I'd like to do is to explain some of the uses for this type of data and to provide some evidence of the reliability and the criterion validity of these measures. So one thing that these types of intensive measurement protocols expose is intra-individual or within-person variability. When you test people on multiple occasions, they don't get exactly the same score. They vary from time to time. This can hamper reliability and measurement precision, which we can overcome to some extent by averaging across these repeated measurements. So in the Einstein aging study, when we average across the 2-week time period, the intra-class correlations or reliabilities are quite high, in excess of 0.97. Averaging across just 2 to 3 days of assessments can hit a reliability benchmark of 0.9, and this corresponds to about 6 to 12 minutes of testing time per test, depending on the test. We also have evidence that there's a decent discriminant validity or criterion validity. The area under the curve for discriminating people with and without MCI is respectable for these tests. The effect sizes are decent, and they're comparable to what we see based on validated measures like free and acute selective reminding that are done by conventional means. Now, one thing we can do with these types of high intensity data is we can average out variability. But the other thing we can do is actually to focus in on the variability to try and understand what are the variables that are responsible for the ups and downs in performance that might occur over the short term. So we can look at how stress or sleep quality impacts cognitive function. And in this example, in a project led by Ruishui Zhuang from Penn State University, who's very interested in social engagement and social interactions and how that relates to cognitive function across different time scales. She did an analysis that demonstrated that high levels of social interactions on one day predict better cognitive performance up to 3 days following that time period. So you can imagine not looking at social interactions, but if you're interested in identifying cognitive changes that could be associated with a therapeutic, either a response to a therapeutic or a side effect, these types of designs can be very helpful. 2 other very quickly potential uses is looking at variability, not just as noise, but as signal. There's ample evidence now to suggest that people exhibit amplified variability in the early stages of cognitive impairment. And then you can also use these types of measurement approaches to distinguish between performance gains associated with repeated cognitive testing and declines in peak performance or asymptotic performance associated with disease progression. So I'd like to just acknowledge my collaborators and the funding source, and to hope that my discussion has encouraged you to consider some of the ways you can use mobile technology to monitor change and characterize cognitive function. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. This was fantastic. Very excited to see your work. Our next speaker is Kristine Williams. She is the Jean Hill Professor in Nursing at the University of Kansas. Her work focuses on supporting family caregivers of persons with dementia, as well as understanding and improving communication in care of older adults. So she is going to talk to us about some community-based interventions to support caregivers using technology.
Okay, are you seeing my screen okay? No.
Yes,
Yes,
I
we
think so.
are.
Yes,
We
yes.
are.
Okay, sorry. It's always hard to know. A little technical difficulty here. All right, I'm happy to be here and kind of wrap up the end of the panel and looking forward to the discussion. This has been very interesting. And I'm going to share highlights from a recently completed study called Supporting Family Caregivers, or what we call FamTechCare. And it looked at providing technology specifically focused on the family caregivers in the home, taking care of someone with dementia. This was a clinical trial funded by the National Institute of Nursing Research that was completed in 2019. And this diagram kind of shows the schematic of what happens. If you start in the lower left box, you see a blue caregiver and a red family member. So we recruited these people. We gave them tablets with special apps on them as their technology support. And with this, the caregiver could record videos of challenging care situations as they occurred in the home. So they could select what they wanted feedback on, make recordings of this, and then they could upload the videos to a HIPAA secure site. And from this HIPAA secure site, we had two different research sites, and each had an expert review team who would meet weekly, either in person or via Zoom, and review the videos that were submitted and provide really tailored feedback to these caregivers in the home. This is some of the technology that we used, and we actually adapted technology this behavior imaging solution company developed for care of children with autism who have similar behavior issues, and that was designed to be used by teachers and parents. So the first screen you can see, this is an iPad mini. It's just got this one app on it, and we did some pilot testing to make sure our older adults could use it. We mounted it on a tripod stand so that it could be moved around the home. In the second slide, you see kind of what you would see if you look at the face of the iPad mini, and this is what the app looks like. So when they want to record something, they can either push the button on the iPad, or they can use a Bluetooth remote control to trigger recording. The technology has a buffering feature, kind of like a TiVo. So if the device is left on, which is what we encourage, it's always recording, but it doesn't capture or save the video footage until they push record. And then when it does save it, it can capture 1 to 5 minutes before they pushed record. So you can actually see antecedents that go into the situation. The third picture is the screen that they can, where the caregiver can review their video and delete it or decide whether to upload it. And the fourth picture is actually the Connect screen, where our team would be able to log in and view videos that were submitted. So this was a clinical trial. It was conducted at the University of Kansas through the Alzheimer's Disease Center, and also at the University of Iowa through the College of Nursing. We recruited caregivers. We had a pretty wide eligibility. At the Kansas site, most of them were connected with the Alzheimer's Disease Center and their services, whereas at Iowa, we really had more of a general public outreach. We had a total of 106 dyads enrolled over the study, and each participated over a 3-month period. So I've kind of told you what our experimental group did as far as submitting videos and getting weekly feedback based on videos. We also, half of our participants were randomized to our attention control group. And these folks would, we encouraged them to submit videos every week, but they didn't get feedback based on the videos until the end of the study. Instead, they got a phone call from a nurse or social worker who would try and help them and provide support based on just what they could talk about over the phone without the videos. We looked at a number of outcomes, primarily focused on caregivers at baseline, 1 month, and 3 months. And then we did linear mixed modeling, really comparing our 3-month intervention and attention control groups outcomes. And so we had several statistically significant outcomes, and this is one: the caregivers' depression was actually reduced in our intervention group, which is the blue line you see here, as compared to our control group that's portrayed with the orange line. Oops. Wait, sorry. Another one, we used a competence scale, the short sense of competence questionnaire, which dealt with how capable they felt at providing care for their loved one. And again, we had significant differences between the groups at the 3-month outcome point. You can see that on the schematic there. We also had a number of other outcomes where we did not have statistically significant differences between groups at the 3 months with our modeling, but we did have statistically significant reductions within our intervention group over the 3 months. And so that was for behavioral symptoms. We were using the revised memory and problem behavior checklist. And then also for caregiver burden, which you see here, we were using the modified Zaret burden inventory. We also looked qualitatively at the interventions that the intervention notes for when we contacted the families and gave them feedback on the videos. And we identified a typology of 10 different primary needs, and they focused on education and skill building, and also on just focusing on the caregiver. We found caregivers were reluctant to let the focus be on themselves. So we had managing behavioral and psychological symptoms, understanding disease expectations. That was kind of surprising that we had to keep providing information on that over time. And then how to assist with activities of daily living that were really outside of the normal realm of a family member. And in each of those three, these were pretty much our top 3 areas of focus that we discovered from our study notes. We did have significant improvements in the caregivers feeling able to manage these over time. Some other areas that came up were safety. That is something that isn't always thought about in caregiver needs for caring for someone with dementia, and then using medical care as well as medications effectively. And then for caregivers themselves, encouraging them to consider respite services, being willing to take social and financial support, and taking care of themselves. And lastly, we found it really critical to provide positive reinforcement because many of the caregivers just really needed to know that they were doing a good job. We looked at satisfaction and utilization. We had quite a range of number of videos people submitted, but an average of 21 videos total over 12 weeks. We questioned them at the end, and 3/4 found that the equipment was easy to set up and use. We did have some issues related to Apple updates that would kind of knock the app out of phase, and we had a team member who was able to connect with them and help them over the phone to update things. 85% found it acceptable, but we did have almost 20% who perceived an intrusion on their privacy by having this video in the capture going on in the home. And that was strongest in people who are caring for someone who had more severe dementia. We did interview our expert team at the end, and I think everyone agreed that using this intervention really helped to effectively tailor interventions for caregiver needs in the home. And it was actually being able to see inside the home like you were almost there, that you could see the context of what was going on so that you were able to decide on interventions more efficiently. There were a lot of concerns though related to Feasibility. I mean, this was a funded study. This isn't a usual service that is provided to people, and we felt it really would fit within their primary healthcare provider systems to be the most useful. We also identified a number of modifications for this technology that really were needed to help the caregivers to be able to capture valuable videos to get the best interventions. And these are just my acknowledgements. And
Fantastic. Wonderful. Thank you so much to all the presenters. You're really stuck to the time you were allotted. It was a lot to cover in 10 minutes. We appreciate, but I'm sure now we'll have a very exciting Q&A session. And after the Q&A, please, to all participants, stay on. I have a quick poll about the webinar, and I want your answers to those questions as well. So the first question is to Dr. Sliwinski. Dr. Sliwinski, is there a training phase with feedback before the EMA begins?
Yes, there is. I'll go ahead and type this in chat, as well as just briefly state we do in-person onboarding where they get some practice, and we've also done remote onboarding during Zoom. As part of the mobile toolbox, we're trying to develop procedures that can support completely hands-off remote onboarding, but those aren't available yet.
Thanks so much. Dr. Williams from Christina Hugenschmidt. Given the privacy concerns, how useful was the look-back buffer? Was it necessary to provide good feedback?
I would say in some of the cases, the buffer was valuable. But I don't think we could have had a system where you just turned the recording on and off because of kind of the immediacy of them needing to push the button to start recording. And I don't know that the participants were really concerned with that buffering. I think it was just overall that video was being captured in the home.
Great, and there is another one for you, so stay on. Can the FamTechCare be disseminated? Does one have to pay for the Behavior Connect platform? And if so, comment on the estimated cost.
Okay, so there's an app, and then there's the site where the videos went for storage. So the app is freely available in the App Store. It's called Behavior Capture. But there was a charge for the HIPAA secure storage to be able to access it. And currently, this isn't an ongoing project, but I know that the behavior imaging company is working on trying to modify it to be more tailored for dementia care. And hopefully the goal is to try and get it to try it within some different healthcare delivery systems. So I don't know if I answered that. It's really not available currently. And it's not typical, it wouldn't be a service typically reimbursed by insurance companies. Does that answer?
But it's a lovely development. Yeah, I think people are eager to have it. Several questions from Kate Papp for Marty. In the Einstein study, as well as the one in Brown, did participants use their own device or were they study issued?
They were study issued, although we're now moving to what they call a BYOD model, which is bring your own device. That introduces some variability, and we're sort of technical variability across devices, screen size, quality. So that introduces some issues that we can deal with, but aren't easy. So we've used SETI provided devices.
Next question again from Kate. Was there any pre-training required, and did that have to be an in-clinic visit?
Yeah, there is a sort of onboarding, which is describing the nature of the study. It doesn't have to be in clinic. We've done it both in person, and then I think Louisa at Brown did it over Zoom. And again, we're working on being able to do this in a completely hands-off manner, but we're not there yet. So there does need to be some interaction with a technician or clinician.
And what could be the challenges for people with MCI to use your smart app?
Well, so we have never had someone be unable to do the study because they couldn't figure out how to use the app. So it's much easier to use this dedicated app than it is to figure out how to configure your smartphone. So it's they just have to press a button and it launches and it does everything. So I think if we're dealing with people with MCI and that type of mild impairment, I don't foresee too much of an issue. Once you start getting into more severe impairment, then for sure.
Another question has to do with variability and whether those indices correlate with functional ability.
I can't answer that yet. And it depends what the answer depends what functional ability measures, but hopefully I'll be able to say some stuff about that soon.
I see great excitement for both of your talks, actually. More questions to both of you from Daniel Bateman. Were your apps developed in-house, or did you work without outside app development with outside app development companies? What was your approach to deciding which company to go with?
Kristine, you want to answer first, or say how
Sure.
you did it?
Our app was really just adapted from this available app. In fact, we had learned about this app for care of children with autism and said, oh, this could be used also for people with dementia. So we did not, we did work on a usability study and were able to get the company to make a few modifications to the app, but basically we used the app that was already developed.
So we have developed things internally. So we've hired a software engineer and he works on this, but we're also partnering now with Sage Bionetworks, which is, they're just fantastic. And we were introduced to them as part of this mobile toolbox initiative. So they will be developing the technology platform that will be the mobile toolbox.
Dr. Williams, did you limit the device use to only one caregiver, or would it work for multiple caregivers?
Well, initially we asked them to have a primary caregiver, but we did end up expanding and including other family members because other family members are frequently involved in care and have their own unique care challenges. And we even had like some grandchildren who would participate as well. But each of those dyads would kind of be treated separately and get their own feedback and their own assessments as well.
Back to Marty. The first question by Jennifer Mumkus was answered already, but does the app work with different operating systems, iPhone, Android? Could it also work on tablet or computer eventually?
So the cognitive testing software libraries work equally well on both Android and iOS. It's the Shell app that sort of runs everything is now working on both. We've done most of the work on Android, but ultimately this will run on both iOS and Android. And what was the second part to this?
The second, computers and tablets.
So at least our app works on both, not on computers yet, although the way the libraries work, it could be deployed in a browser in principle. Yes, for tablets, although that creates issues with, they're not designed for that type of screen, so it won't necessarily look great, although it will run on the tablets.
And again, for you, Marty, is there a way to ensure that study partners are not assisting in the mobile device activities?
No, and not easily. I mean, we've talked about things turning on the front-facing camera, but that creates other kinds of privacy concerns. So not easily. We have reason to believe this is not a frequent issue at all.
Yeah. Not much cheaters there. Okay, and one more from Mia Yang. Is Digital Toolbox Collaborative open to additional sites interested in being beta testers?
So I just typed in an email address and yes and no. So the mobile toolbox, not yet. Soon, hopefully, our version of the app, you can contact us, and there could be some possibilities.
This was awesome. That exhausted the questions in Q&A. If anybody wants to raise their hand, we'll be happy to put you on live if you'd like. Or we can move on to the poll in your evaluation of the usefulness of the seminar.
Yeah, and Marty, if you want to make sure that in the chat you have it sent to all panelists and attendees, we'll be able to see that email that you're referencing. Ready when you are, Liana.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah. Okay, Hannah's going to collect the answers for me, please. Few short questions, very easy. Thank you for your participation, and thank you to the panelists. This was phenomenal. Thank you so much. Please answer these few polling questions, please. Did you find this webinar useful? Yes or no? Hannah, you see how many responses we've gotten. I think we have about 90 participants or so.
Yep, we've got about 60 responses so far. And so if we'll leave it open for 10 more seconds and then switch to the next question.
All right, the next question is, would you recommend this webinar to others? This would be posted on our YouTube channel, so spread the word, but would you?
All right, 5 more seconds. Thanks everyone for your participation.
Now I'm showing you on the screen the 2 questions that follow. Have you implemented virtual technology in your clinical plus research practice? Yes, no. And if you answer no to either clinical or research practice, not using virtual technology, do you mind answering the second question? Which is, if not, how likely are you to now implement virtual technology in your clinical or research practice?
Okay, first question is out there. Give it a couple more seconds. All right, and switching to second question. A couple more seconds. All right, ready for the last question.
And the last question, have we increased the opportunity to explore a collaboration with another ADRC or memory center or one of the presenters maybe?
Amazing participation, everyone. Thank you.
Oh, I love it too. Thank you so much.
Okay, all set.
Wonderful. So it's 3:59 p.m. We couldn't be any better. Thank you so much, Dustin, Jane, Marty, and Kristine. You are fantastic. We had great attendance, engagement, absolutely phenomenal Q&A. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you.
True.
Thank you.